Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
Today I'm going to cover Statesman, a dialogue by Plato. Plato is author 18 out of 200 on my Immortal Books reading list. This is the 8th Plato dialogue that I've read, and it is a sequel to The Sophist. Now, I should be covering The Sophist first on this podcast, but I had so much trouble with that one. I ended up reading it 3 different times. I read 3 different translations, consulted notes. I put questions up on Twitter and got some great responses, and I just need a little more time to prepare that episode. And so after finishing the 3 readings, I kept on in my Plato reading and read The Statesman, and I liked it so much, and I actually finished reading it this morning, but I liked it so much that I thought I'm going to cover this one first, and then I'll go back next week. I need a little more time to prepare, and so I'll cover Sophist next week. So a little flip-flop just in terms of this is a sequel to the Sophist dialogue. But what's happening here is this is part of a threefold plan here, I guess, where we're trying to come up with definitions for the sophist, the statesman, and the philosopher. And so we have 2 dialogues of Plato that are for one of each of those, where we've got the sophist and we've got the statesman. There's not a dialogue called the philosopher. So the question is, was that lost? But probably what more likely happened is we're supposed to kind of generate or gain a definition of the philosopher based off of these 2 dialogues. So we're seeing what the sophist is and what the sophist isn't. We're seeing what the statesman is and the statesman isn't. And based on that, can we derive a definition of the philosopher as well? So at the beginning, there is this statement of we're going to define these 3 people. So next week, the Sophist, this week, Statesman. I loved this one so much. I can't wait to talk about it here in this episode. The dialogue itself for Statesman has 2 main participants. The first is a visitor from Elea, and this is the same visitor that we see in Sophist. And then the other participant is someone named Socrates, but it's not the Socrates that we're used to in these Plato dialogues. This is a different Socrates, and he's just called Socrates the Younger. Now, here's a general outline that I'll expand upon in the next segment. But like the Sophist, we are seeking a definition here. We're seeking sort of the nature of the statesman. And the way that Plato goes about this in this dialogue is through this method of division. So you start with a word, and then does this word define what a statesman is or a sophist is? And no, so then you divide that term into 2 different terms, and then you just kind of have this, it's called a thicket, but you've got this division of terms down the line to try to get to the essence or the nature of what a statesman is. And so that's how this dialogue starts. But then it just takes this wild turn where a myth is introduced right in the middle of this dialogue. And it's set there for the purpose of resetting the discussion. I thought of it almost like a Deus Ex Machina in when we saw that in the Greek tragedies, where if things were just so messed up, if the threads were so and the rope was so messed up that you just needed this God to come in at the end and set things right, to set the strings straight, the threads straight again, and to get rid of the confusion. And so the God by machine would come in at the end of these tragedy plays and just kind of set everything right. And you almost have that sense here where like you just kind of picture yourself in a classroom and you're having this dialogue, and then all of a sudden it's like the teacher says, hey, let's go outside and eat some mushrooms and just see what happens. And you just get this crazy, like mythical creation, all sorts of stuff going on. And then you come back to the dialogue, but that myth really does help reset the discussion, and I'll get into that in the next segment. Then what we get back to in the dialogue is just a seeking of the understanding of the statesman, but of thinking about the statesman in a particular way. And then it closes by looking at different types of governments and how a statesman would rule over people of diverse aspects of virtue and different roles that people play. The version I read is from the Complete Works that's edited by John M. Cooper. So that contains, as the title would suggest, the complete works of Plato, but it's not translated by one person. There's multiple translators. So the translator of Statesman is C.J. Rowe, and then John M. Cooper, the editor, has a little introduction to the dialogue at the beginning. So in the following segments of this episode, I'll cover the main divisions and arguments in this dialogue, and then I'll share the one thing that stuck out to me the most. All right, so in Statesman, there are some general divisions in how the dialogue is set up. And so the first division, it consists of the first 14 pages, and it starts with a definition of knowledge. And remember, we're trying to get to the essence of the statesman or a definition of the statesman, so you can identify a statesman if you were to come across one. But the way that this is to be done in this dialogue is through the method of division. And so, for example, the first 14 pages start with the word knowledge, and then from knowledge we get practical knowledge or theoretical knowledge. The statesman would be on the theoretical side, and then we would get directive versus making judgments, and the statesman would be on the directive side of that. And then from that we get animate, inanimate, and then it just this thicket keeps going on until we get to an idea that the statesman is a herder of humans, or a shepherd. So either a herder or a shepherd, that idea, that term of a leader. And then this is where we get like the smack dab of just the myth coming in, the Deus Ex Machina. And it was so wild. I did not expect this. I know there's myths in different dialogues by Plato, but sometimes they're at the end, and this one's just, kind of hits you right after 14 pages of this discussion, and you're like, what just happened? This is so crazy. And I know I came across some of this myth in Hesiod, in the Theogony, but it was just such an unexpected ride. I didn't know what to make of it at first, but it really does play a part in this dialogue. So I want to read different parts. It gets into, it's talking about the ages of Cronus and Zeus. And so it's going back in mythology, kind of to the start. And so let me just read a few different parts here. So first, the visible age of each and every creature, whatever it was, stopped increasing, and everything that was mortal ceased moving in the direction of looking older. Instead, it changed back in the opposite direction and grew as if it were younger, more tender. The white hairs of the older men became black, and in turn the cheeks of those who had their beards became smooth again, returning each to his past bloom. The bodies of those in their puberty, becoming smoother and smaller each day and night, went back to the form of newborn children, which they came to resemble both in mind and in body. And from then on, they proceeded to waste away until they simply disappeared altogether. As for those who died a violent death, at that time the body of the dead person underwent the same effects and quickly dissolved to nothing in a few days. So I'll stop reading there. It's almost a Benjamin Button-esque type situation here where the older becoming young. Things have shifted. In fact, they talk about the entire direction of the world shifting to the opposite direction. So in helping it move in a circle, and then it starts going the opposite way. So things are shifting here, and this is the age of Chronos. And what happens is this. But to return to what we have been told about a human life without toil, the origin of the report is something like this. A god tended them, taking charge of them himself, just as now human beings, themselves living creatures, but different and more divine, pasture and other kinds of living creatures more lowly than themselves. And given this tendance, they had no political constitutions, nor acquired wives and children, for all of them came back to life from the earth, remembering nothing of the past. While they lacked things of this sort, they had an abundance of fruits from trees and many other plants, which grew not through cultivation, but because the earth sent them up of its own accord. For the most part, they would feed outdoors, naked and without bedding, for the blend of the seasons was without painful extremes, and they had soft beds from abundant grass that sprang from the earth. I'll stop reading there. I wanted to read a large part of that just to get this idea. I mean, it sounds like the Garden of Eden in a lot of these senses. But there's a divine being that is caring for all aspects of humankind. They don't need government. They don't need they don't even need clothes. Like everything is just it's kind of this ideal situation. But the key part there is a divine God. There's a divine sense that of something that is taking care of everything. And so you've got the age of Cronus, but then it goes to the age of Zeus. So Cronus is the father of Zeus. Zeus usurps his father. And so when we go to the age of Zeus, the world starts spinning the other way again. And things go back to where humankind needs to take care of themselves. There's not this God that's taking care of them. So the way that this myth connects to that first part where we ended with the statesman being defined as a herder or a shepherd of humans is, hey, look at this myth. This is, in the past, we had this age of the divine herdsman. You cannot use that same term for the statesman because they are not a herder or the shepherd of humans like this divine herder or the shepherd of the humans was. And so let me read one part here. And this is the visitor speaking. But in my view, Socrates, this figure of the divine herdsman is still greater than that of a king, and the statesmen who belong to our present era are much more like their subjects in their natures and have shared in an education and nurture closer to theirs, end quote. So you see, we've got this split here. These things are not alike. And so we need to shift the discussion and let's go back. So we were outside, we were having crazy time with myths. Now let's go back to the classroom and let's start this discussion again, but without this aspect of the divine shepherd that is, or the shepherd of humans. Let's start somewhere else. So we go back to the classroom and they start with the art of the carer. And then we start kind of this division idea again with the thicket. So the art of the carer is split into the enforced caring or the voluntary caring. And then we shift from the shepherd to this idea of the statesman being a weaver. And I'll get into that a little bit more in just a minute. From there, it starts to shift to a discussion about the types of government. And I found this to be very helpful. So before I get into the types of government, there are three different areas that differentiate governments. And so one is force versus consent. The other is poverty versus wealth, and then there is law versus lawlessness. And so we have three types of government overall, and then two divisions within each of these types. So the first type of government would be rule by one. The second type would be rule by a few, and then the third type would be rule by many. Under rule by one, we have either monarchy or tyranny. And the way to differentiate between these is a rule of law or a rule of lawlessness. So if you have rule by one and that rule is by law, that will be a rule of monarchy. If it's lawless, then that is a tyranny. In the rule of the few, if it's an aristocracy, that is a rule by law. If it's an oligarchy, it's a rule without law. And then in rule of the many, a democracy, you have rule by law for the democracy, or you have a lawless democracy. And so the conclusion of this in this dialogue is that monarchy is the best if it can be ruled by a true statesman. And this statesman doesn't even necessarily need to rule by law. There's this section about how law can be limiting, and law is for the masses, but when you're dealing with an individual case, you really need, if you apply the law strictly each time, that can actually lead to injustice. And there's some great stuff about that. I'll read that in a second. But the conclusion is that monarchy is the best if you can have this kind of smart ruler, this intelligent ruler, the true statesman, and they would be ruling through kind of special expert knowledge. So that's the ideal. But when that goes wrong, it goes seriously wrong, and you end up in the tyranny. So even at that time, they're looking around, and you're not seeing this expert special knowledge statesman. So if that's unlikely, what's the next best thing? Then, well, the next best thing would be to be run by an imitator, kind of the definition of the sophist that we get to some extent in Plato's Sophist dialogue. But that imitator, so if you can't have the real thing, you can't have the true statesman, you have an imitator, but that imitator rules by existing in ancient laws. And so you have democracy by law, you have aristocracy by law. These things would all be better than the lawless side of things, but monarchy with this special expert ruler would be the best. So let me read a few things here about law. So the first aspect, actually, this is about imitation versus expertise in the Statesman. So here we go. Now we said, if we remember that the knowledgeable person, the one who really possesses the art of statesmanship, would do many things in relation to his own activity by using his expertise without taking any notice of the written laws, when other things appear to him to be better, contrary to those that have been written down by him and given as orders to people who are not currently with him. So that's the first part. That relates to what I just said earlier, that this is the ideal, the statesman without taking any notice of the written laws. And then the next part here, well then, if we were to do such a thing without having expert knowledge, they would be undertaking to imitate what is true, but would imitate it altogether badly. But if they did it on the basis of expertise, this is no longer imitation, but that very thing that is most truly what it sets out to be. And that's asked as a question. But again, just if we can't have this expert ruler, what's the next best thing? I want to read that the part about the limitation of laws, and I thought this was interesting. So this is the visitor speaking. That law could never accurately embrace what is best and most just for all at the same time, and so prescribe what is best. For the dissimilarities between human beings and their actions, and the fact that practically nothing in human affairs ever remains stable, prevent any sort of expertise whatsoever from making any simple decision in any sphere that covers all cases and will last for all time. I suppose this is something we agree about. And I'll stop reading there. But you can see the limitation of law, that it even if it applies to the majority of cases, you're still going to have cases where it doesn't apply, and then injustice can occur. So we are left with the picture of the statesman as the one who weaves the many into one, out of the many things one, and almost that idea that we have on our money of out of the many one, and that's what the statesman is to do. So let me read this part here. Whereas the one that controls all of these and the laws and cares for every aspect of things in the city, weaving everything together in the most correct way, this, embracing its capacity with the appellation belonging to the whole, we would, it seems, most appropriately call statesmanship. End quote. So statesman is the one that weaves all of this together. Now, the dialogue closes with a really neat look at the differences in the virtue of courage, and it kind of splits people up in based on their levels of courage. Where one, you've got kind of the orderly person, and they are quiet and moderate. But then on the other side of courage, you've got the excessive manic person that can also be cowardly and lethargic. But the statesman's job is to kind of rein both of those in, but to weave both of those together as part of being the statesman. So let me close out with, and this is the second to last page here. Rather, by working them closely into each other, as with a shuttle, through sharing of opinions, through honors, dishonor, esteem, and the giving of pledges to one another, it draws together a smooth and fine-woven fabric out of them, as the expression is, and always entrusts offices and cities to these in common. And then a little later on, then let us say that this marks the completion of the fabric which is the product of the art of statesmanship, the weaving together, with regular intertwining, of the dispositions of brave and moderate people. I'll stop reading there. So that's where we close out on the definition of the statesman. So we've gone from seeing the statesman as a herder of humans or as a shepherd. The myth kind of resets that discussion. We end up with more of a weaver. And then just the question of, in different types of government, is there such a person as the statesman that could run things in the sense of a monarchy? And if so, that would be the best, but is that even possible? If not, what should we do instead? So overall, the dialogue is just a very neat look at the types of government, the best possible options, the best way to think about things, and then even ideas of different types of people and how they even are on the courage continuum for that virtue. So in the next segment here, I'll cover my favorite thing from this work, the one thing I'm still thinking about after finishing Statesman. Well, after reading through the Sophist and having so much trouble with it, it was just a relief to actually understand this dialogue. And look, it's Plato. It's my first time kind of delving into philosophy, so I know I'm missing a lot, but I tracked with the discussion, I tracked with the arguments, and that was really exciting for me because it was so hard for me on the Sophist. And I think part of the work I put into the Sophist helped with Statesman and understanding it. But it was such a delight just to track and feel like I was understanding what was going on without getting lost. So the thing that stuck out to me the most, the thing that I thought was so interesting and that I can't stop thinking about, is that myth that shows up after the first 14 pages of this dialogue. And the thing that struck me the most is just, I was thinking of how many similarities there were with the Genesis account. And yes, don't get me wrong, there are huge differences in this myth. I'm not saying that they're related or even, based off each other or anything like that. But there's just some really interesting similarities that stuck out to me. I would like to look into it more, but here are three different similarities in the accounts. So first, with this myth that shows up in Statesman, you've got this idea of a golden age, where that segment I wrote or that I read, where the humans were sleeping on grass. It was this idyllic temperature and the food was provided and all that. There's just this abundant plant life, a garden. So there's this age where things are just they're really good, and then there's something something tragic that happens, and in this case, in this myth, the earth reverses. You just think, the sun rises on the other side. Everything shifts. Instead of the old getting younger, the young get older. And then in the Genesis account, there's sin that enters the world, and in that there's this tragic shift that happens. And then the ramifications for that, in this myth, you've got humans having to take responsibility, grow their own food, till the earth, set up governments, and all that kind of thing. They've got to start governing themselves. And you see in the Genesis account too, they're kicked out of the garden. There's this aspect where you must now toil the land to make it produce. So perhaps that's a very simplistic reading, but it struck me, and I'm just curious about that and want to learn more about that. And again, these are the mythological stories of Cronus and Zeus and their battle and how humans were a part of the beginning and all that. So I loved how that myth, though, how that set a different course in this dialogue. And I know other dialogues by Plato contain myths, but most of them are highly intellectual dialogues and discussions. And so this was just so unexpected to me. I'm reading this dialogue 14 pages in, and all of a sudden, bam, there's this myth. But it was really delightful, and it caused me to look at the dialogue, but then how Plato even does the dialogue and see how that shifted it. That was just so interesting to me. I love that aspect. And it just kind of got me thinking, how can story and myth reorient our own discussions and dialogue? So if we're discussing a difficult topic, what's the best way to bring in a story to that? I loved that it came back to the discussion, that the myth was kind of in the middle of this, and it reoriented the discussion, it reset it, but it allowed them to get to a better idea in way of discussing the statesman as one of a weaver as opposed to a shepherd. And it just helps me remember that too, like having the story right in the middle of it, and then the ramifications for the rest of the dialogue. Well, in conclusion, I loved this one. This is one of my favorite dialogues now, this one in Cratylus, which I covered before. I loved this idea of weaving and thinking of the statesman, the ruler, the king as the weaver. And I kept thinking back to in Hedwana, which is our first author, an author in Mesopotamia, 1,500 years before Homer, and she talked a lot about the idea of weaving, but she was talking about it in the sense of words and how the writer or the author is a weaver of words. But I just kept thinking back to that. But here you've got this idea of a weaver of society, a weaver of people and their different roles, and in that being the role of the leader. It's interesting to me that the Sophist and Statesman are not as popular for Plato dialogues. Like even in terms of availability, I like looking and seeing the Oxford World Classics versions of these dialogues by Plato. And if I have trouble with the dialogue, I like buying that Oxford version just because there's really good notes throughout. Whereas this edited set of Cooper's that I'm going through, there's not a whole lot of notes, so I'm kind of on my own. Whereas these Oxford World Classics one have a lot better guides going on, and they don't exist for Sophist and Statesman, and neither do they for in Penguin World Classics books as well. So I find that interesting. So maybe these two dialogues are not as popular, but I really enjoyed this Statesman one. I found it to be tremendously easier than Sophist, but I'm sure the extended time I spent on Sophist helped. Again, I'll be covering that dialogue in next week's episode. As for what's next, the next dialogue is Parmenides, and so I look forward to reading that one. I've heard that one is also challenging, so we'll see how I do on that one. Also in November here, I have a book club coming up where you can join. So if you live in the Nashville area, you can join in person. We'll be meeting on Monday, November 10th. But I also have an option where you can join online, and that will be on Wednesday, November 12th. So if you'd like to join, all you have to do is become a paid subscriber on the Books of Titan Substack. You can do that for as little as $5 per month. Once you do that, I'll start sending you information about the Zoom details. But the book we're covering in November is White Nights by Dostoevsky. I have never read it. I'm looking forward to reading it. I'm actually looking forward to having kind of a break with a novel amidst this deep dive into Plato. And I think that's even kind of what part of the myth in Statesman here helped, is just to kind of get out of the world of dialogue for a minute and discussion and just get into a story. And it just kind of reawakened my imagination, and I loved that. So I've been kind of craving a novel, a work of fiction here for a while. So I think White Nights will hopefully do that for me and scratch that itch. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. Please email me at eric@booksoftitans.com if you have any comments or questions. If you have a general comment on this episode in Statesman by Plato, and it's something that would benefit the community, please leave that comment on Substack where I post this podcast episode. That way other people can see it. They can join in on the conversation. I'd love to get a dialogue going about this particular dialogue by Plato. I know I get things wrong, so if you heard me say something wrong, please add that comment on the show notes, on the comments for this episode. Then other people can see that as well. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, just at Books of Titans, and go to the website at booksoftitans.com, and you can get access to my Substack there. You can see all my reading lists all the way back to 2017. I'll be back next week. I'm planning to cover Sophist, and until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.